morning. Thank you for joining us. We are having some technical difficulties. So we'll get started in about 3 or so minutes just to respect your time. But yeah, we're having some very difficult technical difficulties this morning. But thank you for joining us today. I know it's a beautiful Saturday morning and you want to get out and do stuff after this class. So we will get started promptly. Perfect. Hi, Tim. So while our instructor gets logged in, I'm just going to go over some very basic Zoom things. I'm going to share my screen for a quick sec. Wait. Share. Just some very basic information about the class today. You are in the top plants for the Santa Clarita Valley. This is a virtual landscape workshop today. Just some quick housekeeping items for Zoom webinars. This will be about a 45-minute class with about 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. But please enter the questions as they come to you while Tim is speaking. And you can always message us directly in the chat. But please put your questions in the Q&A and all of those will be answered at the end. Just a little background information about Santa Clarita Valley Water. We're a full service regional water agency. We have about nearly 300,000 people who we service in the Santa Clarita Valley. Here, I will link some of these things in the chat, but here are some landscape resources. We just released our Garden Smarter publication. If you haven't had the opportunity to look at that yet, I highly recommend getting a digital copy or a physical copy. I believe we have some at the library and a few nurseries. A very important resource is this top 100 SCV friendly plant guide. This I will go over at the very end, just to kind of look at some plants that Tim will be discussing today. We do have a smart irrigation controller. So if you're in the process of removing some grass, we also have our lawn replacement program, which you get money for. But the smart irrigation controller, you do not need to remove your lawn for, and that could be up to $150. Also, I know summer's ending, coming to a wrap, but it's still pretty hot. So if you have a pool, I highly recommend getting a pool cover. We do rebate that up to $200. And all of this information can be found on our website at conserve.urscvwater.com. So I'm going to kick it off to Tim. Tim, can you now share your screen?
Let's see.
Or do you need me to run the presentation for you?
You know what? Just for sake of time, would you run it for me?
Okay. Give me 1 second.
Perfect. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you. I'm going to mute myself and turn my camera off now.
Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So what we did when we put this class together, it's based on a list of plants that we spent some time studying the SCV and looking at what plants were reliable. What plants did we know were going to be, low to medium water, will plants that you'd be able to get locally, and plants that pretty much did well no matter where you lived in the valley. And that's what this list is based off of. Keep in mind that not all plants are available year round. Typically, the fall through spring is the best time as far as plant selection goes if you go to the nurseries. And, you know, success is not 100% guaranteed, because if you overwater or underwater these plants, or you live in a particularly cold or particularly hot area, they may be under more stress. And if the plants aren't good quality when you buy them, or they're not installed properly, you know, that can cause problems in the future. But for the most part, the plants that we're going to talk about are plants that do well no matter basically where you live in the valley, what kind of soil you have, you know, all that kind of thing. And that's what we were going for in creating this list. Next slide. We broke the plants down by different types of plants. Next slide. We're going to start with trees. While right now is not a good time to be planting, quite honestly, at this point, I would suggest waiting until mid-October. That's really the beginning of the good planting season in the Santa Clarita Valley. Personally, I would suggest planting anytime between mid-October and the holiday season. The earlier the better, only so you can take advantage of the winter rains to help establish the plants. But our first tree is Chinese pistache. It's got beautiful color, lots of shade in the summertime. It doesn't get too big. You can see it gets to be fairly big, but not too big. And you won't have a lot of problems with roots. You know, some trees have very aggressive root systems. This does not. So this is probably one of my top, maybe 5 favorite trees for Santa Clarita. It offers a lot. It is deciduous, so it'll drop the leaves in the fall, and it won't have any leaves over the winter time, but it comes right back in the spring. Next slide. You can see that there's a big one. They take pruning pretty well, so keep in mind that pruning is not a substitute for picking a tree that's going to get too big. You don't want to put a tree in an area that's going to get too big and then have to constantly prune it, because you'll ruin the shape of it. But if you're looking for a medium-sized tree for your yard, this one's a winner. It will grow in turf, and it does well on, say, drip irrigation in areas where you don't have any turf at all. So it's a very versatile tree. Next slide. Here's an oak. It's a holly oak, and the nice thing about this is it doesn't get to be as big as, you know, probably the most common oak that you see in Santa Clarita is the coast live oak. Great tree, but it gets to be huge. This tree is more of an oak for the yard. It's more of a residential sized oak. Again, it tolerates the soils. It'll take the heat and the cold. It grows pretty quick, which is nice because oaks can be slow to establish. Next slide. There we go. But again, it's a good residential site if you have some room and you're looking for shade. It takes the wind, which is important in Santa Clarita. And it will grow in lawn, which is uncommon for oaks. You know, a lot of oaks are water sensitive, especially in the summertime. The coast live oak is, but this is an oak that really it's not bothered as much. Again, it will do well outside of turf, also on say a bubbler system or a drip system. Next slide. This is a tree that's uncommon, and actually the water agency, Santa Clarita Valley Water, was one of the first places in Southern California to have this tree. We were an early adopter. This tree came from Japan originally, And it was discovered by Disney. When they were building the amusement park in Tokyo, they were looking for trees, and they went all over Japan looking for different kinds of trees that would do well in the park. And they found this one, Japanese blueberry. It's called Elaeocarpus. And it's a great tree. It's in the parking lot up at the headquarters of the Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency, up above Central Park there off Bouquet Canyon Road. And it's kind of unique in that it goes semi-deciduous, which means only part of the leaves drop, and they turn red. If you look at that picture, you can see some red leaves on there, and that's what they do. They turn red when they drop. So it's a great tree. Doesn't get real big. Again, no real root problems with it. It's unique. Next slide. There's a picture. There's a picture of the parking lot with one of the trees in it. And that's a natural shape. Those trees receive very little pruning. And that's just how they grow. So again, it's a great tree. They grow it actually in what we call a columnar form also, which is, it doesn't have the wide canopy like that. It's more straight up and down. If you think about like an Italian cypress, that style. And it's used for a hedge. They plant them side by side, and they get it makes a very natural hedge. So you can get this, and they grow it in a couple different styles. We got the larger canopy again because we were looking for shade for the parking lot, and it's worked out beautifully. Those trees have been in the ground. Oh, that's probably a 20-year-old tree. Very, no real pest problems, no root problems. It's another real winner. Next slide. Crepe myrtle. Again, this is in my top, probably 5 trees for Santa Clarita. They do very, very well. You can get them in lots of different colors. They do great in areas where you don't want to have root issues lifting concrete or curbing or things like that. They stay relatively small. They have beautiful bark that naturally peels. So they're real pretty at night if you do uplighting with them. Next slide. There we go. That's a fairly old tree. Now, that's the drawback to these, is that they grow pretty slowly. So they don't get real big. They don't need a lot of pruning. They're blooming right now. That's another advantage of these trees, is they're a summer blooming tree. So you get a lot of color. A lot of the stuff blooms in the springtime and it's done. And this tree is unique in that it blooms during the summer. So you mix these in with other trees that bloom in the spring, and now you have a bloom season that lasts much longer. They're easy to control the size of them because they do grow slowly. So it's a great tree. Does well in grass, does well in small areas, takes a lot of heat, very drought tolerant. So it's one you might want to look into, and you can, like I said, you can get it in lots of different colors, whites through reds and purples. Next slide. Here's the desert. Now these are some of the more kind of southwestern looking trees. This particular tree is called Desert Museum, Parkinsonia Desert Museum, and it's been bred. It's a hybrid of a couple different trees where they've taken the best qualities of 3 different trees and combined them into one. Absolutely stunning yellow flowers, just gorgeous yellow flowers. Very lacy growth, does not get a thick canopy, gets a very lacy canopy. Next slide. Gets to be a fairly large tree, but because it has a very upright growth, it doesn't take up a lot of room. And again, you can kind of prune this to be more of a narrow tree if you need it to be. So So it's unique looking. It's a good one, especially if you're doing a southwestern style landscape. Let's say maybe you've decided to take out some turf grass and you want to do sort of a no grass landscape. This tree works out beautifully with the cacti and the succulents if you just choose to go for that look. Next slide. So this is a great tree, strawberry tree. I love it because of the fruit on it. Now, the fruit is edible, but they tell me it tastes like cardboard. So I would not suggest eating it. I've seen this in Santa Clarita. They're starting to adopt this more and more as a street tree because it doesn't get to be huge. You know, the city went through a phase early on where they were putting in trees that got to be really big trees for street trees. And they become a big maintenance issue. And so I've seen the city starting to scale back on the size of the trees that they're putting in, which I think is a great idea. And this is one of them. I believe they have these planted on Valencia Boulevard, down by where the old Kmart used to be. If you've been around for a while, you'd know where that is. It's going to be east of where the car dealers are. They recently, and these have been in the ground a couple years, and they seem to be doing very well there. Next slide. So there's kind of the natural look to it, again, as a street tree where they're pruned up to provide clearance, you know, for buses and cars underneath. You wouldn't have to prune it up that way if you didn't want. This is one where you're going to have to watch the water on it a little bit. With clay soils, you know, they don't drain real well, and this tree does like good drainage. So this is one where you can compensate by just not watering as often. Watering deep and then allowing the water to go in for a few days before you water again. And again, they call it strawberry tree because of the fruit kind of looks a little bit like a strawberry. Next slide. So now we're going to go through some shrubs for you. Next slide. This is another one you see a lot around the valley now. Callistemon Little John. It's a kind of a dwarf bottlebrush tree. You see, it only gets to be about 5 feet tall. So instead of being a tree, it's really more of a shrub. This one can be a little bit cold sensitive. So if you live in a really cold place that gets cold every year, you know, down into the 30s, you might want to put this someplace where it's sort of protected by the house. I've seen this, you know, they're using this a lot at McDonald's in the valley. There's a couple of different McDonald's where they've installed this, and they're almost no maintenance, very drought tolerant. Next slide. But they just look like a bottlebrush shrub. You know, you can recognize it that it's a cousin of the bottlebrush tree. They will attract bees. So you might not want to put this next to a swimming pool or a patio. But they attract bees and hummingbirds. A lot of times they're planted real close together to kind of give you a mass of growth. I'm not a big fan of that. I like to make sure there's room to do maintenance. So I would say putting these, you know, 10 feet on center would be about perfect. Next slide. Lavender, it's a favorite, and it does real well in the valley, except it's a bit short-lived. In the valley, typically because of the clay soils, lavender, unless you're really careful how you manage your water, is probably only a 2 to 3 year plant. I think it's totally worth it because it is so beautiful and it smells so great, and it does, you know, attract so much wildlife. I have absolutely no idea or no problem with the fact that if you put it in, it might only last 2 or 3 years before you're going to want to replace it. But just go into it knowing that it's not a super long-lived plant. Next slide. There it's used as a border. I would imagine when it's in bloom, walking along that path, it's very fragrant. It would smell great. And it's a great plant for attracting bees and butterflies. So I would encourage you to use lavender, but just go into it knowing that it's not going to be real long lived. It'll last more than a year, maybe even 2 years or 3 years, but then it starts to get real stringy and thin out. It's just not as attractive. So, use that as an excuse for taking it out and putting a different kind of lavender in. Next slide. Kekiela, heart-leaved Kekiela. This is a California native, and it's prettiest in the spring. It stops blooming this time of the year when it's just so hot. You're going to have to really watch the water on it. Like most California natives in the Santa Clarita Valley, they're water sensitive because of the clay soil, but you can grow it. If you have a really, really bad soil, grow it in a pot. A lot of the California natives you can still have because you can control your soil. You can use a sandier soil mix in the pot. So, get a beautiful ceramic pot, put this in it, put it in a nice sunny spot. In the summertime, like with the heat we're having now, afternoon shade, it'll look better if it gets some afternoon shade. So maybe near a patio or something. Next slide. It blends in well with lots of different plants. So if you're going for sort of a blended plant look in the landscape, this is a great one, especially if you want something with red flowers to mix in. It has kind of a free-form growth habit, sort of a natural style, so you have to give it plenty of room to grow. Next slide. Juniper. Now, this is one that we would consider as a turf substitute, meaning it grows low to the ground and spreads. Now, obviously, it does not look like turf grass, and you certainly wouldn't want to take a walk across this in your bare feet like you would grass. But if you're looking for a low-growing, spreading ground cover, this is a great one. It only gets to be about a foot high at the highest, and you could trim it to keep it even a little lower than that. Takes full sun in the Santa Clarita Valley, doesn't mind the soil type. It's going to be a little bit slow growing. So either you go into it knowing it's going to take a little while for it to spread, or you plant them a little bit closer together. Next slide. There we go. It works well with mulch. Again, if you're going for a spaced out look, it still works fine. Kind of neat that when it gets really cold, and you guys get cold enough up there for this, it'll actually get kind of a purple hue to it. It'll turn colors on you. It'll go from a green, blue to a purple in the real cold weather. This is a great plant if you're looking for like an Asian inspired landscape. If you're going for a particular style of landscape and you want something that's going to be kind of Asian looking, this is a great plant, fits right in. Next slide. Caliandra. Oh, this is one of my top shrubs. It's considered a native, but it's native to the whole Southwest. It's kind of got a wild growth. It's not a real neat growing plant. It gets to be, it can grow taller than 3 feet. That's conservative side. This is used a lot up against buildings and walls. And it's got an absolutely stunning flower. It's one of the prettiest flowers. It's just so unique. Great at attracting wildlife. Next slide. This is one that you can, again, if you really want it and you're worried about your soil or the area where you're growing it in, it does really well in pots. I've had one in a pot now for probably 15 years, and it loves it. It's just thriving. Next slide. Lantana. This one is very popular. It loves the heat, does well with the soil. You see it used a lot on slopes. You can get it in different color flowers. The only drawback, two drawbacks to this plant to keep in mind. One is it is cold sensitive. So a lot of times it'll actually burn back in the wintertime. It won't kill it. I have yet to see a lantana actually killed in the Santa Clarita Valley because of the cold, but they will turn black and get ugly, and you have to wait till spring till they start pushing new growth for them to recover. So that's one drawback. The other drawback, and this is one I take pretty seriously, is the berries on it. It gets little black berries, and they're poisonous to dogs. And for some reason, dogs are kind of attracted to it. So if you have a dog, I would not recommend this plant because of those berries. And unfortunately, they are fatal. So next slide. It has a little bit of an odor to it. So if you like the plant and you have a good place for it, when you go to the nursery, stick your nose in there and just make sure that it's got a little bit of a musky scent to it. Make sure you're okay with that. Again, that's a little bit of a drawback. If you're looking for a plant that's you can put on slopes or in large areas where you can just kind of let it go, this is a great plant for that. As long as you don't have the dog issues, and as long as you don't mind the fact that it might get, a little bit nipped by the cold in the wintertime, it's a good plant, and it's very popular. You'll see, once you've seen it, you'll start seeing it all over the place because it's used a lot. Next slide. Cotoneaster. Now this one, the picture doesn't really show it great because this is actually a low growing plant. It only gets up to be about a foot tall. This is another plant that they have in the parking lot of the headquarters for the Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency. And it's a mass. If you put them 5 feet on center, they'll eventually grow together and just create about a foot tall mass of plant material. Gets these pretty berries. Looks a little bit like a holly. Very drought tolerant. Good plant for under natives. We used it under oak trees, and it's worked out really well because they don't require a lot of summertime water. Be in mind that they do spread, and they, if they're happy, they'll spread more than even 5 feet. So give it plenty of room. Next slide. And it's sort of a mass. Again, this is not a real neat growing plant. This is a plant that has branches sort of going every direction. But it works great in rock gardens. It's great for erosion control. And if you give it room to grow, it requires virtually no maintenance, no hedging or shearing or anything like that, as long as it has enough room to grow. Next slide. Cistus, another winner. You have to watch the water on this one. It doesn't like too much water. It will grow every bit of 6 feet tall in Santa Clarita, and it's not real pretty if you hedge it. This is one where you want to let it grow, its natural form. And it grows in a kind of a mound naturally. Really interesting flowers. And again, you can get this in different colored flowers. So if it's one you like, go to the nursery and look at the different colored flowers to pick the one you like. Next slide. There it is. You can see that's its natural growth form. It hasn't been cut into that. Lots of flowers. Basically, it can be very long-lived unless it gets too much water. Too much water, they'll develop root issues and die early. So that's the one caution on that, is just to be careful. Don't make sure you're not putting it in some place that stays wet. Next slide. Raphilipsis. This is another plant that they have in the parking lot at the Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency up above Central Park. The plants up there are old. They're probably every bit of 20 years old, and they're starting to show their age. They provided fantastic service. They've been almost no maintenance, extremely drought tolerant. They take the radiated heat off the parking lot really well. Beautiful when they bloom. So it's a great plant, but 20 years is probably all you're going to get out of it in the Santa Clarita Valley before you might want to replace it with something that either the same thing or something else, because at about 20 years they start showing their age. Next slide. There we go. And that's its natural form. That's without, no pruning or anything. That's just how they grow. So if you give them the room, they'll do that and be virtually maintenance free. Again, it would work great in rock gardens. It would work great in Asian inspired landscapes. Next slide. Well, let's talk some perennials now. These are smaller plants. Autumn sage, Salvia greggii. It says its origin is in Texas, but it's become established throughout the entire Southwest. Very low water requirement. Again, this works really well under things like oak trees, where you don't want to be applying summertime water. If they have some shade from the oak, they require almost no water in the summer once they're established. Speaking of establishing any of these plants, the first 2 summers in the ground, they're going to have to be babied a little bit. Now, after you get through the first 2 summers, then you can really start cutting back the care and the water, because they're established and they can take it. But even the real drought tolerant plants, you have to watch them a little more carefully in the first 2 summers. This is great for hummingbird gardens. Pretty flower, unique flower, and it grows upright. Next slide. Here we go. It's become quite popular. It's again, this is another one that's great in containers, and it's somewhat deer resistant. So if you live out on the fringes of the valley and you have problems with deer, you might try this. Next slide. Giardia, this is a perennial. Again, it's got a relatively short life. On this one, I'd say 3 to 4 years in the ground before it starts to fail. The heavy clay soil in the Santa Clarita Valley, that's it's prevalent in probably 90% of the valley. It's really hard on plants, especially plants that like soils that are well drained. So typically what it does is it shortens the lifespan. Where a plant might live 6 to 8 years naturally and look good, in Santa Clarita, it might live, 3 to 4, something like that. And this is one of those. It's real pretty for the first, maybe 3-4 years, and then it starts to get kind of raggedy and fail where you'd want to replace it. Next slide. But it's a great pop of color, and it's a unique color. So it does well amongst other plants. Next slide. Achillea, this is another one you see a lot now. And this one kind of naturalizes. It can almost become a little bit invasive. But it's a very reliable plant, unique flowers, comes in different colors. And this is one that if you have an area where you're having trouble growing plants, it's kind of a problematic area, I would try this one. And then watch the water. Don't give it too much water, because this is one that naturalizes pretty well. So even with a minimal amount of summertime water, say 2 or 3 applications during the hot months, I think you'll find it'll thrive, and you'll find it's going to spread. So be aware of that also. Next slide. There we go. But it's great if you're looking for a meadow look. Maybe you have a big piece of property or hillsides, and you're looking for something that's going to give you kind of a meadow look to it with flowers. This is a great plant for that, and it attracts butterflies and bees and hummingbirds. Next slide. Penstemon, This is another great one that it mixes well with sages and things like that. So if you're looking for kind of a mixed look, this is a great one for that. Attracts lots of wildlife. Like loves full sun, prefers just a little bit of shade in the afternoon if you can get it. Probably doesn't have to have it to survive, but it won't look as nice. So if you can put this someplace where it gets morning sunlight and then maybe a little bit of afternoon shade, it'll look its best. Unique kind of bell-shaped flowers. Next slide. There we go. And you can see they get to be fairly large. You know, you could put this plant in maybe 6 feet or 7 feet on center and it would fill in. Takes the clay soil, but you got to watch the water. Don't overwater it. Works well in rock gardens. This is another one you could integrate into an Asian style landscape. And though it's not traditionally an Asian garden plant, it would work. Next slide. This one's great. It needs a little bit of regular water and it spreads on its own. So be aware of that. As a matter of fact, this is one of those plants that you can put it in your yard and before long you might see it popping up in the neighbors' yards too, a little bit. So that may be a good thing, that may not be a good thing, I don't know. But it grows up to about a foot, maybe a little over a foot. Each plant will spread maybe 3 feet. But eventually it fills in to make a mass like that. This is really nice under trees. You know, if you have a big area of trees, maybe lawn right now, you could take the lawn out and put something like this in and it would just fill it in and give you those pretty flowers. Next slide. And as you can see, it's not a real neat plant and it will overflow onto sidewalks and things like that if it's planted too close. So make sure when you're putting this in, especially if you're using it as a border, you keep it, 5, 6, 7 feet back from the walkway because it'll eventually creep out towards there. Next slide. This one, the kids just love it because it's called lamb's ear, and it really does feel like the very soft hair that you would feel on a lamb. It's very tactile. People, once they feel it, they can't help but touching it. But this is great for small areas. It can get to 12 inches. Usually it stays a little shorter than that. And it's just kind of a gray mass planting. Next slide. And it's used kind of to cover in areas. It's great for a border plant or a rock garden plant. Again, it's great as a tactile plant. If you're putting plants in for different reasons, maybe for smell or for taste, and you want one for touch, this one's unique that way because of the soft feeling the leaves have. Next slide. Heuchera, this is a great plant, again, under trees. This does well under oaks and other trees. It doesn't mind the shade. It will take some sun. It prefers afternoon shade, when it's really, really hot. Next slide. There, it's planted in mass. Those plants are probably put in 3 feet on center, and you can see they just fill in. And it has that unique dark colored foliage and the flower stalks. Next slide. Daylilies. Boy, daylilies, there's lots and lots and lots of different colors of daylilies. And they're a great plant, again, because they're blooming right now. They're a summer blooming plant. So they mix in well with other plants that bloom in the spring and in the fall so that you can actually set your garden up or your landscape up to have color all year round. Something going on all year. And this is a great one for the summer. Lots of different colors. Next slide. Strap-like leaves, they can get quite large, actually. They can get to be 2 feet, maybe almost 3 feet across. And the beauty of that is you buy them, you put them in the ground 6 feet on center, and eventually they'll fill in. The other neat thing about this plant is it's very easy to divide, meaning you can split this plant to propagate it and create new plants. So if you want to spread this plant around your yard, and you have a few years to do it, you can buy it and then, once a year, take it out, divide it, put the original plant back in the ground where it was, and take your new plants and put them where you want them. Next slide. Rosemary, there's lots of different varieties of rosemary. This is one that often ends up in a kitchen garden because it is edible. It is an herb. Beautiful flowers. You can get it in whites and blues. Extremely drought tolerant. It's a Mediterranean plant, but it has a scent to it, a nice scent. Attracts bees. And you can get a very low growing variety, or you can get an upright growing variety. So depending on what you're looking for, you can actually get a bush style rosemary, or you can get a ground covered rosemary. Next slide. That's a new one just put in. That's going to be a ground cover style, and it's with drip irrigation. They do very well with drip. They also do well in planters if you're or on top of walls if you're looking for something to kind of cascade down over a wall and sort of soften that look. They'll take the heat of the wall and they will cascade down. So they're great for softening hardscape. Next slide. Russian sage. This is a little bit of a tough one for Santa Clarita. It doesn't really like our soil. But if you manage the water, it will do well. And it's pretty, beautiful flowers. Next slide. It has kind of a shrubby look to it. Again, so it's used for informal borders and mixes in well with other plants like sages. This is a summer blooming plant. A lot of the sages are springtime blooming. So if you mix these in with your sages, as the sages start to stop flowering, these will come on and continue to flower. And they have very much the same look. They'll take heat very well and reflected heat, so up against hardscape. Next slide. Sedum. Now this is a succulent, which are becoming really popular. And they have a unique flower. They take our heat. They flower through the summer. You have to watch the water on them. Believe it or not, even as a succulent, you have to watch the water because they really prefer a well-drained soil. So don't overwater these. Being the fact that they hold so much water in them, they can go a surprisingly long time, even in the summer, without being watered. Next slide. There are lots of different types of sedum. So once you start looking at them, you'll be amazed at the variety that you have. Here it's mixed in with some ornamental fescue and other plants. So it kind of stands out. It works well that way. Next slide. Coreopsis, this is one of my favorite for the flowers. I just love the color of flowers that this plant has. And it does real well in dry, hot areas. It does still need some water, but not too much. Next slide. And you can see it grows in kind of a mounding shape. Here it's been planted sort of as an informal edging. So it works well as a mass planting. There are actually some dwarf varieties of Coreopsis that don't get as tall. So check out Coreopsis if you're looking for a bright yellow summertime flower, because this is a winner. Next slide. Okay, the ground covers. Next slide. There we go. So blue fescue. This is a very drought tolerant ornamental grass. It does not need to be mowed or any of the kinds of maintenance that you think about when you think of grass, turf grass. But it's misused a lot, and that is this plant really does not like direct hot afternoon sun. What happens is you'll see this plant around a lot in this time of the year, and it's brown. And it isn't dead. It's actually gone dormant because of the heat and the amount of sun that it's gotten. It's not terribly attractive. But if you put this in shady areas or protected areas that don't get afternoon sun, it'll keep that beautiful blue color all summer long. Very drought tolerant, almost no maintenance. Great plant, but just make sure you give it some shade. It'll look so much better than the stuff that's being planted in the full sunlight. Next slide. And that's typically how we use it there. If you put them a little bit closer together, it'll form a mat of color instead of being, there you can see individual plants. Nothing wrong with that look, just kind of what you want. But you can see that there's a lot of shade in that area, and that's why it's kept that blue color. If that area was getting full afternoon Santa Clarita Valley sunlight, it would be brown. The good news is it won't kill it. It'll come back. It's just not terribly attractive this time of the year if it's in full sunlight. Next slide. Diamondia. This is a winner, almost to the point of being overused. Very drought tolerant, extremely low growing, grows almost like carpet. So it's used a lot in between like stepping stones. If you have an area where you want a ground cover that stays extremely low, take some foot traffic. I wouldn't play a football game on it, but you can certainly walk across it. It gets little yellow flowers, not a lot of them. I wouldn't plant it just to get the flowers, but it's got a gray color to it, and it's a winner with regular water. In dry areas and not much water in areas that are shady or have soil that stays kind of moist. It's very drought tolerant. It's a great ground cover. A little bit slow to fill in. This is it would probably take a couple seasons in order to fill in a whole area with this. Next slide. There we go, and there's the flowers, and you see. I mean, in that picture, for as big as that area is, you've only got 5 or 6 flowers that really stand out. But it's unique. It's got kind of a unique to it. But you see how low growing it is, which makes it very foot friendly. Next slide. Myoporum. This is, again, it's used a lot in the valley on slopes. Extremely drought tolerant. You have to be careful of actually overwatering it. That's probably one thing that'll cause it to fail is too much water. So be careful of that. It gets a pretty flower. You can get, again, there's different types of myoporum, so you have to kind of know what you want. They have a myoporum that grows very low, like 3 to 6 inches. Again, kind of a turf substitute. And then they have another one that gets up to about 18 inches that I'm seeing it used a lot on slopes in the valley. Very drought tolerant, stays green all year round. Next slide. You see, you can almost use it as a turf substitute. It would take a little bit of foot traffic, not a lot, but it's great if you're just looking for a mass of green plants that are drought tolerant. It works really well for that. Next slide. There we go. I think that's it. We made it through. Now, real quick before I hand this back to Laura, what I want to do is, one, I'll answer your questions, but two, I also want to let you know that This is just a portion of the plant material that is covered in the top 100 guide that the Water Agency has put together. And that guide is something that Laura's going to show you here in a minute. I thought maybe I'd answer your questions first and then turn it back to her. So she'll introduce you to the guide. So if this was just a sampling of what's in there, but if you're looking for additional plants, possibly to use in your landscape, there's a lot more selection in the guide. And again, now is not a great time of the year to be planting, but it's a great time of the year to be planning. If you do your research now and start lining up your plant material and stuff like that, come mid-October, when the good planting weather hits, you'll be ready to go. You'll know what plants you want to use. You'll know how many of them you need to get, and maybe even talk to the nurseries and place an order. Tell them that you'll be picking it up in mid-October, so they'll have the stuff ready for you. Okay, with that, any questions?
All right, so I do have some questions in the chat. Somebody asked if that book is in the Casaic library too. I'm going to assume if you're asking about the Garden Smarter, yes, those should be available. We put them out every few months. I don't know if they still have any available, but they are at the library. And you can definitely go to Green Thumb, and there are some at the Green Thumb Nursery. Okay, this one's for you, Tim. You said the Japanese blueberry tree can grow with a large canopy or in a container. Would we know which it will be when we purchase one?
Yes, absolutely. The nurseries actually grow them specifically in that style for you. So if you're looking for the columnar version of it, like you want to do a hedge along your property, when you buy it, it will already be trimmed in that style versus the open style like we used in the parking lot.
Okay. Next question is, you said under oaks and full sun for autumn sage. That seems like opposite.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on how big the oak tree is. And under the oaks, because we don't want to be watering established oaks in the summertime. The nice thing about the autumn sage is it has the same kind of water requirement. So it doesn't require a lot of summer water. It likes some morning sunlight. You know, when I say direct sun, I'm thinking kind of along the edge of the canopy of the tree, where it can get some morning sunlight before it gets too hot. But in the late afternoon, when you have your hottest temperatures in the valley there, it prefers getting some shade. So a lot of times what we can do, we can use the house kind of orientation of the house to help with that. The east side and the north side of the property is usually where you get the most mild sunlight, even in the summertime. You'll get morning sunlight, but afternoon shade. And the same with trees. If you're looking at, you have a big oak tree and you wanna plant some of this underneath it, look at the east side and the north side of the tree out near the edge of the canopy as the areas where it'll still get sunlight in the cooler part of the days, but it'll get some shade in the afternoon. Any other questions? Okay, well, Laura, why don't you you can show them the guide, and I can answer any questions on that too, or you can answer questions on that.
Yeah, okay, so here is and I dropped it in the chat as well, the link to the guide. And you can always call our conservation team and we can mail one out to you, but this is what it looks like and it's easy to reference. You can easily pull it up on your phone. We do have native plants and then we just have other plants that do well. So if you really want to do more of a native garden or pick native plants, we do tell you which ones are. And we even went a step further and we kind of even put like the water and sun coverage on that, how big they actually grow in square feet. when they bloom, and the benefits. So, there's the ones with the stars are, yeah, so it says, look for the California natives by there being a star next to it. So some of these are even native to the valley, which is pretty awesome. Then we also have some ground cover, some succulents, trees that are native. So if you kind of know what you want to do with your garden, this is definitely a great guide. And we even include photos so that you know what it looks like. Yeah, so some shrubs. If you have questions about actual plants, right now would be the time to ask Tim. Tim is an expert with plants, me not so much, but I can point you in the right direction. So the first few pages are all native, and then these are other low water use plants. So these are not native to the Santa Clara Valley, but they do well. So, and on this page specifically, we have more pictures than names. But if you then go to, let's say you like this, number 20, you'll see that it's the 4-night lily. So this is probably my favorite guide. I redid my lawn. I completely ripped out my lawn, and I kind of looked at the photos to see what I wanted. I will be planting in October because right now it's way too hot. But I highly recommend having this, especially bookmarked when you are planning and actually like trying to see what you want in your garden. Are there any questions about the guide? I don't see any questions, but at the very end, there's also some QR codes to some project assistance or inspiration. All of these are actually on our website, so you can actually click on this link and it'll take you to this landing page that'll give you some awesome inspiration. So here it is, and it'll give you the name of the plant. So we just have a ton of resources to help you make this a good experience for you in transforming your landscape. Okay, seeing that there are no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and end today's webinar. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. I will be sending an email out when the video recording becomes available, so you can rewatch this. All of our classes are available on YouTube a week after. So if you want to reference even older ones, please go to our website for that. Thank you, Tim, for hopping on this morning.
Sure, my pleasure.
Yeah. And then next month, we will have another class coming up. These are monthly, and we will have one in person in October. So I'm looking forward to that one. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tim.
All right. Bye-bye. Have a cool weekend.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.